Welcome to this webinar on dependent children's registers. My name is Emily Hanna and I'll be taking you through how they work today. Firstly, we'll just do an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders today. So I wanted to start this webinar by just giving you a bit of context and background about the situation that the dependent children's registers were created in. So if we think back to the early part of the colony of New South Wales, the government had been involved in running institutions for neglected and destitute children from the very early days. So it recognised there was a need to start to take in destitute and neglected girls from 1801 when it started the female orphan school, and it started the male orphan school in 1819. The Roman Catholic orphan school opened in 1836, and the female and male orphan schools were amalgamated together in 1850 to form the Protestant orphan school in 1886. And that's the photo that you see there on the left-hand side of your screen. The government also extended its involvement to other institutions during the 19th century. So some of these you would have heard of. So places like Randwick Asylum for the Destitute Children. There were the industrial schools and the nautical training ships. So the Vernon and the Sabran, for instance, those nautical training ships. And then places like Biloela, the Parramatta Industrial Training School for Girls, which became Parramatta Girls' Home later on, and Shaftesbury Reformatory School, which was also for the girls, and the Farm Home for Boys at Mittagong from 1906 onwards. And then things changed, or were starting to change in the 1870s. The driver for that change was the Royal Commission into Public Charities in 1873. And the reason that this was held was for a few different factors, one of which was the concerns about high infant mortality in institutions. And also there were starting to be concerns about adverse psychological effects of children from living in large residential care institutions. So it was felt that children would benefit from living in more of a family setting. And so it recommended a boarding out system for orphans and destitute children. So kind of like what we know today as fostering out with families. And in 1879, a boarding out society was established and it arranged for children to be boarded in with suitable families. Now, the State Children's Relief Act wasn't established until 1881. And this established the State Children's Relief Board. The board was established for the care of children who were destitute and whose parents were unable to care for them. So it could direct the removal of children who were neglected or destitute. It also licensed approved people to receive destitute children. Now, foster parents had to be of undoubted good character. The sex and age of the foster family was carefully considered in the placement of children, along with the accommodation and facilities for the child's education and moral training. Inspectors and ladies visited foster children and their homes frequently to ensure that they were properly cared for. So during this time, after 1881, around 5 children per 1,000 were boarded out. The State Children's Relief Board could also arrange adoptions to approved persons, but it wasn't the only organisation that could do that. They could restore children to their parents or guardians, and as part of what they did, they also supervised school attendance. In 1896, things changed a little so that the board could then approve allowances to widows and deserted wives so that they could support their own children at home rather than having them boarded out to other families. So basically mothers could receive an allowance and they could keep their kids with them. And by about 1912, around half the children were boarded out with their own mothers. So it was really something that was desperately needed. The Children's Protection Act was instituted in 1902, and this was the first of a few acts that started to extend the powers of the board. The board then had authority over adoption of state children under 3. The board could also monitor and inspect lying-in homes and the care and custody of the babies who were born there. And the board could commit children to the board, courts could commit children to the board's control, where the children were considered to be endangered or without proper guardianship. So they're starting to tighten things up even more. This picture here of these babies on the floor is from the Home for Invalid Infants at Thirlmere from 1907. This home and the Home for Sick Infants at Paddington took in children who were dying as a result of neglect, willful exposure, and improper feeding. A lot of the children were drastically underweight for their age, and often children were illegitimate and they had parents with their own mental and physical issues. Mothers could be admitted along with their babies, and they were helped to learn how to care for their babies and fed properly from local milk and local food that was produced, and a lot of them went on to survive and leave the home. In 1905, the Neglected Children and Juvenile Offenders Act was enacted, and this recognised the need to do more for children who were falling between the cracks, those wayward children. It established some more specialised shelters, industrial schools and reformatories for destitute and wayward children, and this act is also the act that constituted children's courts. So children's courts were established in 1905. The Act authorised institutionalised children to be placed in the board's care for boarding out if it was appropriate. So they would look at the kids, and if those kids could then move on to more of a foster family situation, they would do that. And it authorised the board to request the minister to move a child between institutions. So the board could then ask for that to happen. After 1923, things changed again. So the Child Welfare Act of 1923 dissolved the State Children's Relief Board, and that's kind of the end of our period for this talk today. This is when the Child Welfare Department was established, and this ran all the way from 1923 up until 1970 when Youth and Community Services was established. And adoption is another thing that's just of interest here. So I just wanted to mention this because adoption is one of those funny things in terms of the records and how it worked. So adoption was available as an option from 1881. The board could arrange adoption, but so could private organisations and individuals. In 1907, 176 children were permanently adopted by foster families through the State Children's Relief Board, and numbers were increasing year on year. The board reported that adoptions were often carried out by childless married couples or parents who have suffered bereavement of their own children and have taken the little destitute orphans to cherish in their place. But whilst the board, as I just said, could arrange adoption, adoptions could also be organised by private organisations and individuals. By 1912, the board was concerned about adoptions happening outside its control, and it could even happen through advertising in the newspapers, and it was concerned that this kind of practice was encouraging baby farming. But it wasn't until 1923 that adoption arrangements were more clearly outlined and formalised as part of that Child Welfare Act. And then arrangements were reviewed and amended in 1965. So there's been a few changes over the 20th century to adoption. Now we're going to look at the actual records. So the Dependent Children's Registers is series NRS 13358. They run from 1883 to 1923. So 1883 is the first date that we see of children going into care, and they run to the end of the board's existence in 1923. The surviving records that we have relate to children in the care of the State Children's Relief Board, so those in state care. They record where the dependent children were placed, so whether with foster parents or guardians, and note when some were eventually adopted. And the big news for those of you who might have looked at these on microfiche in the past is that now they are digitised and indexed. Hooray! And you can view them on the website. And you can look at them through our catalogue. And so the remainder of the talk, we're really going to look at how can you find them, what kind of information can they tell you, and all of that sort of stuff. And if you're keen, you can still come into our reading room or go to the State Library of New South Wales, where you can view a black and white copy on microfiche and look at them that way. So that option's still available for those of you who'd like to do that. So the registers give you a lot of information: name of the child, their age, religion, where they were received, the name and known addresses of parents, and any remarks about the parents. Sometimes they're quite disparaging. So you've just got to bear in mind that these records are of their time and take them as such. You get details of foster parents and guardians, so their names, addresses, when the child was received by the foster parent and when they were transferred on, how they were placed, how they were eventually disposed of, and the date. So this could be by adoption, back to custody of the parents, or the child could have attained the age of 18 and be discharged of age. So there's a few different things that can happen there. Now, when you go to the website to try to find the registers, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. So I'll show you both ways. The first way is to go to our homepage, and the website is www.records.nsw.gov.au. On the homepage, which looks like this, you can click on the online indexes there. So I've just drawn a big red circle around where the online indexes are. So click on that link and it will take you to our online indexes. So usually what we do with the talks is prepare examples earlier, just in case there's some sort of huge internet fail on the day. So that's what I've done here. So with the online indexes, they're arranged alphabetically by subject, and you'll find the dependent children's registers under C for childcare and protection. So go to C, not D, C. C for childcare and protection. Click on that link there and it will take you to a page where we've got a few indexes about childcare and protection, including our one today, the Dependent Children's Registers. So I've circled the title there. If you click on that title, you'll go to a page that gives you some more information and abbreviations that show up in the register, and also a link to search. The other thing that you can do is just click here on search, here on search this index, and it will take you directly to the search page. So what I've done today is just gone straight to the search page, and this search will search on any of the fields that you can see there. I've chosen the name Hannah Cassidy, which I've circled there in the green. So I could pick any name in the world, but I picked Hannah Cassidy. And what it shows me is any entry that has Hannah Cassidy in it anywhere. And you can see there all the different places that those words can show up in the index. So number one hit is a child called Hannah Cassidy. Hooray! Her mother was also called Hannah Cassidy. So you see that hit in the mother field as well. So the next child, Edward Cassidy, also has a mother called Hannah Cassidy. The third child, Queenie, just the comment says same as Hannah Cassidy. So her entry shows up. And the fourth child, Henry Cassidy, shows up because we've got the Cassidy surname on the left-hand side, and then on the right side, one of the foster parents also has the name Hannah. So we get 4 children there. What I can do is then click on the details link there, and that will take me to the catalogue where you can see the record itself. So our next screen is what happens when you click on that details link, and you see here the entry in the catalogue. So I've clicked on the Hannah Cassidy entry there, and I come up with a page like this. So again, I get all of those details, including her date of birth, her date of admission, parents' names, and any of the guardians and foster parents all written there. But if I click on the item list link, which I've circled, that will take me directly to the entry there. So I need to click on that to see the entry. And this is what you'll see when you click on the PDF link. I can download this image from the catalogue to my computer by clicking the download icon there. So I've circled that for you. That's the arrow with the line underneath it. And I can also print it using that little printer icon. The other thing I could do, and this one wouldn't come across in my snip to the PowerPoint, is I can right-click on that page and some options will come up, including Save Image As. So then I can follow my computer instructions to save that image to my computer. So there's a couple of different ways there that you can save that image to your own computer. Now, just to have a look at the full page entry, you can see it gives us a lot of information about her background and the arrangements for her fostering during her time in care, of which there were quite a few. So we'll take a closer look at Hannah's page and see what it can tell us. So I've circled a few things there. Excuse me. I've circled a few details there that we can look at further to find out more information about her. So the first thing I've circled is her age, and it gives us her birth date. So she's born on the 21st of November, 1897. And when she's admitted, she's 10 and 3 months. So that's what that circle is telling us there. The next circle across the page is her date of admission. So she's admitted on the 7th of March, 1908. And when you go across to the next circle, it says whence received CC. So CC means Children's Court. So this is after 1905 when the Children's Court started. It's 1908. And at this stage, children could go through the courts and be found to be neglected or whatever, and then alternative arrangements for their care could be made. Now, the next thing that stands out for me looking down the page is the next circle, which says also 11262. Now, if you look at the top right-hand corner there, Hannah's page number is 11092. So if I went and looked at page 11262, that should have some relationship to Hannah. And then if I look across the line there, it says see Sister Queenie. So it will turn out, and we'll see this eventually, that Queenie's page is 11262. So it's referring me on to Queenie as well. Now there's also, in the particulars of foster parents or guardians section below, there's some other information that's very useful. So we can see there all of the people that she was fostered out to. So the first one is the Reverend Mother Baptiste at the convent at Marrickville. But before she goes there, there's also an abbreviation for CHM. And there's another thing I've circled there called depot. So we're just going to have a quick detour to talk about those for a second. So CHM referred to Cottage Home for Invalid Children at Mittagong. So there were also cottage homes at Parramatta, and these were set aside for the accommodation and special treatment of invalid and sick children who could not be put into ordinary boarding out conditions. So Parramatta, Mittagong, they were considered to be quite healthy situations, healthy places at the time. And so children would be sent to these places to recover and convalesce if they could. In 1907, there were 9 homes with the capacity for 20 inmates each, and they were at Mittagong, and they were in the charge of a mother who looked after and nursed the children. Sometimes the situation was that the mother would have her own daughter, who would be fully adult by that time, to assist in the care of the children. At Mittagong, the food was grown locally and supplied from the farm at the Mittagong Farm Home, and the boys from the Mittagong Farm Home actually did the work. So I quite like these photos, and I thought you should just see them. I love their white dresses. I don't know if that's what they wore every day or just when there was a particular photographer there, but they certainly look well cared for there. The depot referred to the depot for state children that operated out of Ormond House at Paddington between 1884 and 1923. Children were taken there when they were removed from the Roman Catholic and the Protestant orphanages, the Benevolent Asylum or Randwick Asylum. From Ormond House, children were issued with a set of clothing and then boarded out. Children being returned from boarding out placements were sent back to Ormond House, and there were also some older girls that lived there semi-permanently, caring for younger children. So it's interesting to note too that Ormond House as a building was built in 1826, I think, and is one of the oldest mansions in Sydney. I think it still stands, actually. The Metropolitan Children's Court and the Shelter for Court Children also operated at Ormond House from 1905. New court premises and the Metropolitan Boys Shelter were built at Albion Street in 1911, and things had become quite overcrowded, and so the State Children's Relief Board were wanting this to happen for quite a few years before it actually happened. So Ormond House kept operating as the depot and the Metropolitan's Girls Shelter until 1923, and in that year the State Children's Relief Board was replaced by the Child Welfare Department, and the depot moved from Paddington at Ormond House to Glebe to Bajura, and the Metropolitan Girls Shelter also moved to Bajura in Glebe at that time. So talking about discharging, we can see down the bottom that Hannah, and this is the bottom half of Hannah's sheet, she was discharged of age in 1914 and she was nearly 17. So DOA doesn't mean dead on arrival in these records, it means discharged of age. So children were usually boarded out until they were 12 and payment for their support ceased at that time. Children were then apprenticed for 5 years, so girls would be sent off to domestic service or dressmaking or whatever, and boys would be sent off to learn a trade. So they might be sent to farmers, pastoralists, bakers, bootmakers, butchers, bookbinders, coach builders, chemists, plumbers, tailors, and so on. So the idea was that they would learn a trade and eventually have the skills to earn their own living. Apprentices were supported by their masters and paid a weekly pocket money. Their wages were paid into an account, and 1/3 was paid to the child when they completed their apprenticeship at about 17, and the remaining 2/3 was paid to them when they turned 21. The reason that they did this was that they found a lot of children squandered their money if they received the full amount at the age of 17. Secondly, it was also noticed that previously neglectful relatives who displayed a lack of interest in the welfare of the child whilst it was in the care of the state suddenly developed a remarkable affection for them when they learnt that they had a few pounds. So that was just some mechanism to protect the money of the children a little bit as well. So Hannah's sister Queenie, this is her card here. So we can see 11262, that number that we saw earlier on. And you can see there in the comments it says father and mother, same as 11092. So that sends us back to Hannah. So we know they're sisters. And we can see that Queenie's experience was quite different. She was fostered out to one family at Leichhardt and then adopted. So we can see that. We also see here we've got a C also, 7763 and 4. So we can go and have a look at those entries. We see 7762 for Edward Cassidy. Now Edward came up in the search that we did previously on Hannah Cassidy, because Hannah Cassidy was also the name of his mother, the same as our Hannah. So we know that these children are siblings, and we can see their details of the father being deceased, the mother. We can see that Edward was admitted in 1903 when he was 11, so he's older than the two girls. And then we've got the number 7763, which was actually on Queenie's card there, 7763, for Henry Cassidy, also admitted in 1903 at the age of 9. His details of parents are same as Edward, so they're all linked together as siblings. The BD that you see for whence received there refers to boarding out depot or Ormond House. So the board would usually board out a maximum of 3 children to each home, but they would try to keep siblings together if they could. So if there were more siblings boarded at the same time, more than 3, they'd try to keep those together if they could. I noticed that Hannah and Queenie were separated, but perhaps that was because Hannah wasn't very well and had to go to Mittagong, whereas Queenie was quite healthy and she was just fostered out in a straightforward way. And it looks like the experience was a lot more successful for Queenie from these records. Now, this is the bottom of Queenie's register entry. Parents could make payments to maintain their children where they could, and parents also had the option to repay maintenance to the government. The board also made efforts to recover money from parents and near relatives that could contribute to the maintenance of the parents, but the board also recognised that it was not possible for all families to make these payments, and so they would end up writing off a lot of that debt. By 1908, the maintenance for babies under 12 months was 8 shillings per week, and the maintenance went down by age. So at that time, the maintenance payment for children aged 3 to 12 was 5 shillings per week. In some instances, as we touched on earlier, children were boarded out with their own mothers. This gave widows and deserted wives an allowance to support their children under the age of 12 in their own home. Desertion could include a range of circumstances, such as the father being insane, in a hospital, in an asylum, or a jail, as well as deliberately leaving a spouse and children unprovided for. And by 1907, 3,025 children were supported in this way. Now, the other way to get into the dependent children's registers is to go directly to the catalogue. So I've gone back to our homepage here, and I've just typed the name Hannah Cassidy into the search box there, and then hit the big red search button on the left-hand side. So what we come up with is a lot of entries in the catalogue that have Hannah Cassidy, those words in them. And so I need to filter down to just the Dependent Children's Register. So I do that by, on the right-hand side of the screen there, just clicking on the Dependent Children Register Index, that little box you can see there that I've circled, and then in the green Apply Filters box. Another thing I could do in this particular instance is just click on digitally available, but what that could give me is a lot of photographs, or it could give me a railway card or something else that was digitally available. So in this instance, I've chosen to just pick Dependent Children's Register and limit my search to that because that's what I'm particularly interested in. So what I come up with is the same names that showed up for me in the online index, but I'm just that step closer to viewing those entries here. So we've got Hannah, Edward, Queenie, and Henry. Happy days. Now, I could also change my search. I know that Edward Cassidy was the father of the children. So what would happen if I did a search on Edward Cassidy? So we didn't find Queenie here because Queenie's register entry doesn't have the name Edward Cassidy on it. So when they've indexed the records, they've just looked purely at that one document and just indexed the details as shown on that one document. But what I do see here are Edward, Hannah, and if I look down the screen, there's a Mary Cassidy, which paid with page 7764. Remembering I've got Edward at 7762 and Henry just below that at 7763. So to me, I think, aha, that's probably a link and possibly another sibling. That's interesting. There's a Leah Dorothy Mills, so I'm not going to worry about her. And then a Frances I. Cassidy at a completely higher page number, 18095. So I'm not going to worry about him at this stage. But if I click on the entry for Mary, we find out that she is actually another sibling who was boarded out at the same time as those first two boys in 1903. And the other interesting thing that we see is that they all went to the boarding out depot together. And if we look closely at the foster parents, we find that the three children were all fostered out initially to the Dooley family together in 1903. So they were kept together in 1903. Later on, she was separated from them, so the names of the foster parents between the three children does change, and she was discharged of age in 1912. So I think that's quite an interesting link to find all of those children together. Now, I could do that same search in the online index. So I've gone back to the online index just to see what happens there. And this gives me a bit of a different view. So here I've searched for Edward Cassidy again. I come up with the same names as we did in the catalogue, but this different view allows me to see more information at one time. So I can see all the parents' names listed there. So again, Frances I. Cassidy, Mabel Cassidy, mother, not really interested in that for this one. And Leah Dorothy Mills, her mother is Amelia Mills, not interested in that one. But then I see Edward, Hannah, Mary, and Henry. So we've got the father's name all the same. We can see all the foster parents listed out for us here, and we can see that Edward, Mary, and Henry all shared those same foster parents initially, and we can see that Hannah had quite a different experience there. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can also download this view into an Excel spreadsheet. And you see that there at the bottom where I've circled Excel and CSV. So if I clicked on that link there, I could export all of this data that I see into an Excel spreadsheet. I could put it into a PDF, or I could print it if I wanted to as well from here. So to do that, it comes out like this. And this is an Excel spreadsheet. And from here, I can manipulate that data. If I had lots and lots of entries, I could search to see how many were all fostered to the same people. I could do a search back in the index on the foster parents and see if they fostered anyone else out. So I could sort and play with this data in Excel as much as I liked. And I might find more entries there depending on the search that I did. Maybe not. Maybe there was only 5 of them. But I thought that's an interesting thing to know. Now, there are other ways to search the dependent children's registers. So you could search by page number. So I could have done a search, as you can see up the top there in that graphic, on Cassidy 11262, and that would have shown me Queenie. So from Hannah's page, I got that extra page number. I could then put that in my search box and come straight up with Queenie Cassidy there. Hooray! I can search by name. So we looked at searching by a child's name. We looked at searching by a parent's name. I could search by the foster parent's name. I could search by siblings. So there's a range of different names that you could search by. You could also search by date. So you could search by the date of admission and then see who else was admitted to the depot on the particular day. The thing is, you'd also come up with birth dates as well, but there wouldn't be too many, so it might be a way to sort of filter through entries. And you could also search by stroke number. So you can see Queenie's entry there. We've got the citation, and it includes 11 stroke 22108, if you can see that. So that's the volume number. That's the number that we give to the whole book that all of the entries in that particular book show up in. And there's probably 300, 400, 500, 600 children in each book. So if I did a search on 11 stroke 22108, it would just pick up all of the entries in that book. If I did that search in the online indexes and exported it to Excel, I could then sort that data however I liked to have a look at all the children who were admitted to boarding out in that book, so roughly at the same time. And so that might be an interesting sort to do. Or you could search by the book number and then maybe the surname. So were there any other children with the same surname in that particular book that show up? And they might be relatives or not, but it might just be another useful way to do a search there. Now, I did talk about abbreviations before, and we had a look at some of those abbreviations through the talk. On the online index, the For More Information page, we're adding abbreviations as we come across them. So you come across things like DOA quite frequently, discharged of age. And I think I've included that, although this might be an earlier permutation that I put in the talk the other day. I'll have to go back and check that one. DOB, date of birth, deserted wife's pension, DWP, BOA, boarded out allowance, BA, benevolent asylum. So you see a lot of children come from the benevolent asylum across to the State Children's Relief Board, and we're going to continue to add to this list of abbreviations as we go forward. So that's on the For More Information page to do with the online index for the Dependent Children's Registers. Now, there are some limitations of the registers, so spelling variations can be a big one. Just keep in mind that even between siblings, whoever's written up the children at the time could have spelt different, the surnames differently. So one example might be Cassidy or Cassidy, or Edmonston, for example, EDMOND or EDMUND. So you can come across that. So be a bit flexible with your spelling. Just remember too that all the details aren't always given in every entry. So you might come across one child that's got the parents' names listed and a sibling who's just got same as previous child. And if it's just a same as, the parents' names won't show up in the index because they weren't actually on that particular page. So you have to put things together like a detective. So looking at the page numbers, admission dates, that kind of thing. So remember, the information that isn't on the page isn't included in the index. And also too, we think that there was a record keeping system for the children who had been boarded out early on that hasn't survived. So we think that this is more like a later record that was started sometime in the 1890s. And so there are records from very early in the system that we don't seem to have. And we're just picking this up as these things have become digitized and we're able to look at them really comfortably and really carefully. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Here we've got Edith Conroy. Now she was admitted at the age of 6.5 in 1889. If you look down at the particulars of foster parents or guardians, you see the first person that she's boarded out with there, Constance Rogers. That entry isn't until 1897. So what's happened between 1889 and 1897? You can see there's a red note that says see Book 4, Folio 89. And our suspicion is that that C book would have contained all of the earlier details to do with Edith being fostered out, but those earlier records haven't survived, and so we don't have that earlier information. And I think that there's probably children who their whole time would have been recorded in that earlier system. So there are children that we don't pick up in this system just because they were recorded in the earlier records that haven't survived. But where those children, their care overlapped from the previous record system to these dependent children's registers, they did bring that information across, but they may have only recorded the fostering out details once they'd started the record. So they may not have brought across everything, but just maybe the date of admission and possibly brief details of the parents. See, this one doesn't even tell us the parents' names, but helpfully does tell us that the father's in a lunatic asylum, but not which one. But it does tell us that she was received from the Benevolent Asylum in 1889. So records of the Benevolent Asylum might give us some clues as to her background or possibly even her parents' names. So we can link back to there perhaps to find out more information about Edith. Now, after 1923, the State Children's Relief Board was dissolved in that year, and the Child Welfare Department was formed in 1923, and that ran all the way up to 1970 when Youth and Community Services took over. The records that were kept by the Child Welfare Department that are similar to boarding out registers, dependent children's registers, were then called boarding out registers, ward registers, and they ran from 1923 to 1936. So we're not talking about those today. Now that they're over 80 years old, they are open to public access and you can view those in our reading room, but they have the digital copies of these records are not available anywhere, unfortunately, but you can visit the reading room to view them as long as the information in there is all over 80 years old. Now, these registers give us name of the child, similar sort of things, where they were born, their date of birth, religion, details of parents, details of the foster parents, and they also note how the child was eventually disposed of. So were they returned to the family? Were they adopted? Did they attain maturity? Now, where else can you find information? The Find and Connect website is really, really helpful. So that gave me some information about Ormond House, and that's a website where you can look up homes that looked after children throughout the 19th and 20th century, and it will also tell you which organisations hold surviving records for those homes, if there are any, and where you can contact to get access to those records. So, of course, we at State Archives hold records relating to the government and the government's role, but there's a lot of religious organisations and other organisations that also dealt with children in out-of-home care, and you'll find information there that can lead you on to where you need to go to find records of children who were in a particular convent or a particular privately run home or whatever. There's the Sydney Benevolent Asylum website, which covers, it's an index online covering the years 1857 to 1900. And a lot of children were transferred from the asylum to the care of the State Children's Relief Board after 1881. The index only shows you name, age, and admission and discharge dates, but you can write to the people who run that website, and for a fee, I think they will check the registers that exist and provide you with more information about those children. I personally, in writing this talk, also found that the State Children Relief Board annual reports were amazingly helpful, actually. So a lot of the fuzzy photographs that you've seen I've just taken from the annual reports, and then also some of my facts and figures about how things ran also came from the annual reports there. So you won't find names of children in there, but it's really helpful for that contextual information about, okay, so there were cottage homes at Mittagong, but what were they about and how many kids were there and how, you know, some of those sort of really high level details about how they were run and that kind of thing. So they're quite interesting and useful. You'll find some on the OpenGov New South Wales website, and the ones that I found, I actually cheated and just Googled State Children's Relief Board Annual Report 1907, 1910, whatever, and then I got the Google link straight to the OpenGov website. So that was very helpful. And you can also find them in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly votes and proceedings. And we've got physical copies of those at State Archives for most of the votes and proceedings. And you'll also find them at the State Library, New South Wales. And the other thing that you can read too is that early Royal Commission into Public Charities. That was 1873, and that is part of the votes and proceedings for 1873-74. And I found a copy of that on the New South Wales Parliament House website. So there's quite a bit of information out there if you're willing to look, possibly not a lot about your own personal child other than what's in the dependent children's registers, but there's information around about the system and how it operated and some of the problems and things like that. That's quite interesting if you're keen enough and willing enough to go there. And I just wanted to leave you with another image from the Home for Invalid Infants at Thirlmere. I just really like this one of these poor nurses and all these babies, and they're all just set up so beautifully for the annual report. I guess the photographer had been there that day and they're taking the photos for the annual report, and it's yeah, I liked it anyway. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today.